Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Professors Podcast, Episode 2, with Michael Johnston from Victoria University of New Zealand. Michael, great to see you.
Thank you, Salvatore. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, hey, it's tough to get on this program. I'll tell you, got to be a real A-lister, at least in our little Tasman bubble. Do we even have a travel bubble still, or I know they canceled it. Has it come back? Are we allowed to see?
I have lost track. I'm hoping it will come back by the middle of the year because I would like to make a visit to Melbourne.
Yeah, by the end of the year? You're ambitious. By the end of 2022.
July is my plan. Yeah.
Have you got masks on in New Zealand in stores and such?
Yes, in supermarkets you have to wear a mask. Oddly, the rules in cafes are very strange. You don't have to wear one while you're sitting at a table, nor do you have to wear one outside, which is highly sensible. But you are supposed to wear one between the door of the cafe and taking a seat at the table. Obviously, COVID is a very polite disease. It doesn't interrupt people having their meals.
I have to say, we had pretty well observed mandates here in Australia, and then they got rid of them, and they tried to bring them back just before Christmas, and things have been pretty lax, I have to say. A lot of virtue signaling, a lot of masks below the nose.
Below the nose, yeah.
Almost nobody checking in. I've been shocked because, of course, it's a massive invasion of civil liberty to force people to check in everywhere they go. But on the other hand, yeah, it's pretty easy. I do it. And I've been surprised when I go to the supermarket, I'm the only one who's checking in.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, not that it matters. Of course, we do both live in liberal countries, but I guess the question becomes, what if we don't? And you and I both work at universities, so we're on the cutting edge of finding out about illiberality.
Which is a terrible irony, isn't it? The very institutions where liberalism ought to be at its strongest leading the charge against it, it would seem.
It is the irony, and that's why we've called today's episode Academic Freedom in New Zealand. So how's academic freedom in New Zealand? What's going on?
Well, if you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have said that it's probably the healthiest in the Western world. We hadn't yet started to experience the kind of cancel culture that's it's become quite emblematic of universities in the United States and the United Kingdom and possibly in Australia as well. I think there's been some incidents there of people being cancelled and so on. But now things have changed, and it all started to change, I would say, 2 years ago when the Vice Chancellor of Massey University, who actually happens to be Australian, decided that she would ban from speaking on campus a former leader of the New Zealand National Party for his views on the Treaty of Waitangi.
Now, for those of us who are not in New Zealand, is the New Zealand National Party some kind of ultra right-wing nationalist fascist party?
No, it's roughly equivalent to the Australian Liberal Party.
Yeah,
sans the Catholicism. So it's a centre right.
I know. I could imagine
actually very mainstream, very pragmatic kind of political party. But Don Brash, who was the politician in general, had the view that the Māori parliamentary seats should be abolished. He believes that there should be simply a general electoral roll for all New Zealand voters, and this was enough for Jan Thomas, the Vice Chancellor of the university, to seek to cancel his speech. And in fact, he was cancelled. And in fact, she lied about the reason as well. She said that it was due to security concerns, but a little bit later, there was some emails leaked that showed that they were searching around for reasons to cancel.
Security concerns covers many sins. I can imagine. Yep. I can imagine Tony Abbott being deplatformed at an Australian university. In fact, I'm not sure he hasn't been, and it would come as no surprise. But
no, indeed.
But that excuse of security, is almost like a weaseling out, because of course
Mhm.
universities are very concerned with safe spaces and with providing a quote unquote safe learning environment for students. And so I would imagine that there would be the accusation that bringing someone in who, in Australia opposes an indigenous voice or imposes acknowledgement of country, or in New Zealand who opposes dedicated Maori seats, that person might be banned on hate speech grounds. But have we not seen that happen yet?
Well, the hate speech legislation that we're concerned about, or I'm concerned about, and some of my colleagues are also concerned about, hasn't made it into law in New Zealand yet. It's certainly been mooted, and the legislation has been drafted. I must say it's not very coherent. And when
Mhm.
it was put forward for consultation, neither the Prime Minister nor the Minister concerned was able to determine, for example, whether it would cover the vilification of baby boomers for dominating the housing market, for example. So it seems to be quite unclear what it does in fact cover, which makes it, of course, extremely dangerous, because it
Yeah.
will be left up to judges to decide what the intent of the government is, when if and when it actually becomes law. I'm actually hopeful that the bad publicity that it generated on the basis of its lack of
Yeah.
clarity might
But
be enough.
universities have anti-hate speech policies. It doesn't have to be a law to be
Oh,
effective
that's
on
true.
you and me.
Yeah,
We have
that's true,
anti.
and of course that can be construed as anything that anybody says it is. So, yes.
Well, I mean, the people don't realize that when Peter Ridd was fired at Charles Darwin University, it wasn't for his views on the Great Barrier Reef. It was because he uh, said negative things about colleagues in an email.
Mm, yeah.
Which, while not exactly hate speech, was along the same lines of, well, he hurt colleagues' feelings and
Yeah, well,
against
that's right.
policy, right? But
And
back to
you
what
know,
you said about
I think actually that the issues here, at any rate, are not so. I mean, setting aside incidents like the one at Massey with Don Brash and in fact Megan Murphy, the trans exclusionary radical feminist, was also banned from Massey University, and she was subsequently hosted by their meeting, Speak Up for Women, um, which is a gender critical feminist group, was subsequently hosted by the ACT Party, which is uh, strange times breed strange bedfellows. The ACT Party is in fact sort of libertarian market economic um, party,
Mhm.
and so David Seymour, the leader of ACT, set up a meeting for Speak Up for Women in the Houses of Parliament in lieu of their being able to meet at Massey University. So,
Yeah, but the security weasel is an interesting one, because I mean, we had this situation arise at University of Sydney when Bettina Arndt, the feminist, was hit their organization inviting her to campus was hit with a security fee. And
mm,
on the one hand, well, it is true that in order to have a controversial speaker on campus, the university will have to provide additional security. The fee was modest. It was a few $100s. It wasn't going to bankrupt anybody. On the other hand, it wouldn't have bankrupted the university to just cover the few $100 security fee. But then again, it sounds reasonable from an administrative standpoint until you ask, well, isn't that the mob veto? I mean,
mm,
shouldn't the people who are going to cause a problem pay fines, not the people who are peacefully meeting, right? If I want to have a protest and I think someone's going to attack me, I have to pay a security fee. Well, shouldn't the university just protect me? And if someone attacks me,
yeah.
charge them
I mean,
for
my view is that is the case, that universities should go to very great lengths to protect academic freedom and to protect the, you know, the free discourse that ought to be able to take place on campus. we can imagine circumstances in which that might become too difficult. You know, we would stop short, I think, of saying that a meeting should go ahead if there was going to be egregious violence, or if the university just didn't have the security means to prevent a riot or something like that, then you may have to be pragmatic. But you know, if I was the vice chancellor of a university, I would certainly spend a few $100s to ensure that an event could go ahead, because the damage to academic freedom is much worse, or much, you know, is certainly worth avoiding at that kind of price.
I guess what troubles me so much about it is that these fees are placed on the judgment of a risk manager. So like if a university just had an event fee, anyone who holds an event has to pay a fee. After all, there's the room, there's electricity, you know, there's need for security for, you know, people, the parking people have to be put on duty on a Saturday, that sort of thing. Well, okay, there's a fee to hold an event. But that a risk manager determines that your event is likely to spark controversy, therefore you have to pay extra, that does seem to be against the spirit of free inquiry and free debate and openness, and it just feels wrong somehow.
I agree. It's not ideal at all. And actually, the thing that worries me most is the ability to use the excuse of security concerns to make events more difficult or impossible to run. And that is what happened with Don Brash at Massey. They used the security concerns as a pretext, and there's no doubt about that. That it showed up in the leaked emails that they were completely mendacious when they said that that was the reason, and that they were casting about for a way to prevent the event from going ahead. So, but I agree with you. I mean, I think having risk managers and so on is it's very anti-academic.
One more level of the administrative university. Look,
and
Anthony,
really what we should be doing with students, I mean, it sets terrible examples for students, and this is something that worries me very deeply, that we've got a generation of students who think this is normal because we've allowed it to happen.
It is now. It is normal.
That to me is a tragedy.
Anthony wants to ask us, in New Zealand, do you have problems with universities taking political positions? That is, the university itself takes a political position. And before you answer that, let me say, Anthony, if you want to actually come in the live stream, put a note in chat. I'll send you a video link, and you're welcome to join us if you'd like to have a three-way discussion. But Michael, do the universities actively take political positions themselves?
I haven't seen any cases of them sort of proactively taking political stances, but I would say that banning a speaker on political grounds is taking a political position. So that has happened a couple of times at Massey. And, you know, a recent event in New Zealand, which has actually attracted some international attention, I would say, has also had its political aspects. So what happened there was that 7 professors from universities in Auckland wrote a letter to a publication called The Listener, which is a mainstream New Zealand magazine, media magazine. And in this letter, they warned about moves being made by the New Zealand Ministry for Education to introduce into the senior secondary science curriculum Māori cultural understandings alongside and co-equal with science. And the argument that they were putting forward is that while Māori cultural knowledge, or mataranga Māori, as it's said in Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, is not science, and therefore should not be part of the science curriculum. They didn't seek to disrespect it in any way. They were very clear that it is important to cultural activities, and and it should play a part in political decision making in New Zealand, but it should not be treated the same as science when in an epistemic sense. Now, anybody might think that this was a pretty reasonable position to take when we consider that Mataranga Māori includes mythological elements. And so if we say that it can stand alongside scientific understandings, then when, say, we're teaching young people about the astronomical relationship between the moon, the sun, and the earth, we may bring in stories of a demigod called Maui who slowed the sun, this kind of thing. Now, I think that there's a strong place for mythology in the school curriculum, but it's not in science courses. And so to that degree, I agree with these professors. But what happened was absolutely beyond belief. There was a furor, and they were called all manner of things, including racist and by the Tertiary Education Union. The Vice Chancellor of Auckland University said that they'd caused dismay and hurt amongst the staff and students at her university, which strikes me as a mission of failure on her part, because she obviously had not run a university where young people were prepared to grapple with controversial ideas. Not that this seemed even particularly controversial, and also admitting that her staff were not up to the task. So,
well, what's so funny about that is, I mean, what is New Zealand? About 20% Maori or 25%?
15 to 20, depending on how you
15, 20%.
Yeah.
I mean, New Zealand is certainly a minimum 15 to 20% practicing Christian, maybe more, and a larger percentage of the population is of Christian cultural heritage. Yet, if someone said that, well, out of respect for that, Christian elements of the curriculum should be brought into science and social science understandings, they would scream and say, well, what? No, we got away from that. That was 150 years ago. I mean, you know, I mean, Darwin is in and God is out, right? I mean, that's, it's just amazing to me that many people see indigenous knowledges in a different light from their own cultural heritage. After all, we all have cultural heritages, and well, why shouldn't a Christian or Judeo-Christian understanding? I mean, why isn't Genesis also an equal scientific account?
A science textbook, yes.
As some Americans in Kansas would have it be.
What was it, 40 years ago or so, they had a legal furor in the United States about that, where some states were teaching creationism.
Yeah. But they were teaching creationism as a pseudoscience. Go back 100 years, they were teaching creation. It was simply straight, Book of Genesis says this, and that's creation. And, God created the world and in 6 days, rested on the seventh. And I don't see why that has any lesser epistemological. Why, if we're going to create an epistemological equality between Western science and Maori knowledge, why isn't Christian knowledge put on that same plane? And for that matter, Hindu knowledge and other forms of knowledge?
I suspect you know the answer to that question.
Well, I know the answer, but it's still
political. So it's not an epistemic question at all. And in fact, this is the regrettable thing, you see, because when things like that happen, and there's this kind of hue and cry about it, based on just raving nonsense, really, it becomes impossible to have a proper conversation about it. And there is a conversation there to have. I really think there is. Not about putting Mataranga Māori into the science curriculum, but what actually are the epistemic differences between a scientific worldview and one that does come from an Indigenous perspective. And people have sincerely held beliefs, and I don't wish to disrupt that or disrespect it. If people have religious views or spiritual views, I'm completely respectful of that. I don't hold them myself, but I could be wrong for all I know about all sorts of things. And I can also see, not necessarily benefits from the perspective of understanding the natural world in the way that science allows us to do, but personal benefits and social benefits in having religion and spirituality as part of a culture. So I would be the last person to want to disrespect that. But unfortunately, when we have this kind of political response, it becomes impossible to have a nuanced and thoughtful conversation about what the differences are, which is a shame because, as I say, I think there's an important conversation to have. And in particular, it's a good idea for us to think about what science really is, because it seems to me that all too few people, even scientists, actually have thought through or learned ever the philosophical underpinnings of their discipline and what has made it possible historically. And I would say that a very strong part of that is in Western history, the separation of not just church and state in a political sense, but psychologically, the separation of spiritual matters from material matters. So we're talking Cartesian dualism, this kind of thing.
We'll have to debate that, but you said you don't know everything. I know someone who does know everything, and allow me to introduce you to him. Anthony Carr is joining us. Anthony, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there, Anthony. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if everything works.
We can hear you, and I'm going to boost your volume so that we can hear you even more. Thanks for joining us on short notice like this. And, Michael, I don't want to make you share the stage, so to speak. So I will. But Anthony is always there in the chat. And, let's let Anthony just ask his questions right up front. But I have a question for both of you. This idea that the duality of the physical and spiritual world in Christianity is somehow, responsible for the West. I have to tell you, with all due respect, I think that's a load of crap. I mean, and to say so, I point to Ethiopian Christianity and Orthodox Christianity that didn't develop these scientific traditions, or the fact that science really developed in the Protestant countries much more rapidly than in Catholic Europe. So, I mean, are you guys so sure that Christianity has much to do with the rise of the West?
I think it does. Yeah, I agree with, now I've got to try and remember the name, Rodney Stark, who wrote a book, Why the West Triumphed, or words to that effect. I can't remember the exact title of it. And he says that the nature of Christianity, he quotes a think tank in Beijing in the earlier part of this century, which said...
Yeah, the real experts here.
I wish I could look up the quote, but I can find it in my computer, but it's hard to find an instance notice, where they basically said they'd looked at all the reasons why they thought the West had been successful and China in particular hadn't in the last millennium. And they looked at whether we had better science or better technology or better military operations or a better business organization, etc. Yeah. And they concluded, according to Rodney Stark, that the real reason was Christianity.
Yeah, or an alphabet. But Michael,
I just throw that in. I'm not saying it.
Well, I think the relationship is complex. I think there are some elements of Christianity that arguably gave rise to early scientific thinking, but there are other elements of Christianity that sought to stifle it. I think particularly of Galileo, who was threatened by the Inquisition.
Yes.
And so, what it seems to me happened, and I'm no great historian of philosophy, so this is just from my own reading and thinking. I'm not a scholar of this stuff, but it seems to me that what Descartes was getting at, I don't think he invented dualism. I think he identified it in the culture, and that after the Middle Ages, probably because, and you mentioned Protestantism, Salvatore. I think it happened in northern Germany in particular. Capitalism got going on the Baltic coast with the Hanseatic League and this kind of trading empires, which generated a kind of social mobility that hadn't existed before. And it was at the same time that Protestantism took off that that sort of disrupted the medieval worldview, and then people were held to be in direct responsibility to God rather than mediated through a priesthood, which gave them it really shook up the whole sort of spiritual world for them. And I think that this did lead to a separation of spiritual thinking from material thinking, which eventually allowed the material world to be discussed in a way that was free from sacred considerations. So obviously at the time of the Galileo, that was not the case. That at that point the church saw his ideas as objectionable enough to threaten him with the Inquisition. But a couple of centuries later, Darwin came along, and by that time, this separation was complete enough that although there were religious objections to evolutionary ideas, he was not advancing those theories at the peril of his life.
Well, I think partly it's certainly as far as the West versus the Middle East, for example. Thomas Aquinas should be looked at, because he operated on the principle that God would not do so, that it was possible to discover physical laws, that God was consistent in what he did, that they didn't act unilaterally, as it were. I'm trying to think of the right words at this stage, but that there was in effect cause and effect which could be discovered.
Mm-hmm.
And it was whereas say the Islamic world looked at had a doctrine of occasionalism, if you like, what has been called occasionalism, where you had, now you're testing your old memory here, I'm not prepared. It was Galazi, Al-Galazi, who was a Persian philosopher who wrote a book outlining what he considered the errors in the world, and one of them was that God, say in the Islamic world, to say that God has to act consistently or acts consistently is by basically what's the word? Sacrilegious, to restrict him in what he could do.
There's some limitation on the power of God if God is required.
So if I picked up this mobile phone and dropped it, then the direction it goes is caused by God at that instant.
And that's very nice of God to do it. But
the thing is that's enabled the West to develop scientifically.
We're all intellectuals here, even you, Anthony. And
no, I'm not. I'm just. I communicate with the confidence of ignorance.
I think we have far too much. The whole academic world puts far too much weight on the development of science. In the intellectual sense. I'll tell you, one of the most influential books on me, and one of the books that most influenced me that I've ever read was a history of ironworking in the United Kingdom that was written in the late 19th century. And, the whole Industrial Revolution didn't come around because a bunch of people at, Oxford or Cambridge were sitting under trees and apples were falling under their heads. It happened because of tinkers and, people just playing around with stuff. And, and I think it happened that England and maybe Northern Germany and, Flanders had societies that allowed a lot. I mean, look at Gutenberg. He may have printed a Bible, but not because he was religious. He printed a Bible because he was a tinker who came up with a great invention, and the Bible was sure to sell.
Bible for what people want to read. But I think there's certainly truth in what you're saying, Salvatore. But I don't think that you can. I wouldn't go so far as to say that science isn't an important component of the success of technology either. I mean, certainly the Industrial Revolution was critical, and but that was itself fueled by certain discoveries that had been made prior to the Industrial Revolution. And
the other way.
But a lot of
we wouldn't have, for example, nuclear power if it hadn't been for Rutherford.
I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any science, but
I know you're not saying that. But I mean, I guess this is a little bit oblique to what I was. The point I'm trying to make, which was irrespective of what contributions science has made to civilization, the fact that it can exist at all in this way that allows, or up until now has allowed, the exchange of ideas and the testing of ideas rigorously, is in part, at least, because we've separated understanding of the natural world from spiritual considerations. Because if you don't have that separation, then you have priesthoods coming in and interfering and saying you're not allowed to say that or think that.
So here's where we differ. I think of us as a priesthood. I think it's the old story of the Heidelberg professor saying, well, it works in practice, but will it work in theory? That's the academic question. I'm a little less concerned, I guess, about the stifling of intellectual freedom on campus, because I just don't think campuses are that important. I'm much more concerned about the think tank world, the media world. I mean, that's where I worry that we're perhaps losing freedom of inquiry.
But why are we losing it there? I mean, it seems to me that it all started on campuses. And what's happened is that a whole lot of students,
I think you're right,
for several decades now, are being filled up with postmodern nonsense and taking it out into the world and promulgating it through the media and think tanks and all the rest of it.
Them's fighting words, Michael. Postmodernism is the house philosophy of democracy. But I'm an American postmodernist, not a continental postmodernist. So I will draw a distinction there.
Oh, Salvatore, I think you're... I think a lot of scientific advance occurs outside of universities, because universities, I suspect, are for the conserving of our civilization rather than developing new technologies and even scientific advances. So many things come from people having a problem to solve. And like Joseph Harrison, developing the chronometer. The scientists wanted to do it by observations of the planets and the stars. You can do it, but Joseph Harrison came up with the clock. But it's interesting with technology. In about 1100 AD, I'm told the most advanced steel industry in the world was in China, but the Mandarins didn't like it, so it was closed down. And when you think about...
and they're closing it down again for the Beijing Olympics.
When you think of certain things, like the printing was invented in China a few hundred years before Europe came up with it, and movable type was invented in Korea, but yet they did nothing with it. Our societies used it to, people were free enough to communicate and print books and etc. In fact, the advance of printing around the world, there was a fellow called Bob Woodward, I think he was a professor at NUS years ago, who said that you could track the printing around the world by where the missionaries were. In fact, you had more printing going on in...
Yes, that was Woodward, and he is a fantastic and controversial political scientist, one of the best quantitative political scientists out there.
Yeah, I don't know where he is now, but I met him when he came to Australia years ago for the CIS, and I went to this thing quite by accident, and I found it worthwhile. And by the way, I noticed you mentioned Rutherford. Some of the Rutherford family were friends or sort of in-laws or outlaws. Some of my family, actually.
Oh, no, none of those stories. Let's give after the show, Anthony. But Michael, so I mean, New Zealand. I mean, a lot of us on the outside think of it as the gentle land of hobbits, and everything is just kind of nice and pleasant there, but also a bit clubby, right? I mean, as an American, I find Australia intolerably clubby. But to what extent is
I'm a director of a club? How do you?
Yeah, not to malign actual clubs as such. But Michael, to what extent is New Zealand academia, a closed club that you've got to be in it or you're out?
Well, I mean, it's a very small community, of course. Where so to that extent, it has all of the advantages and disadvantages of small communities. The advantages that I've found of working here, especially since in education, which is where I'm situated in the Faculty of Education, I like to do work that is of relevance to public policy and so on. And it's relatively easy to do that in a small country. I've met almost all of the ministers of education in the last 15 years, and I've connected with think tanks and so on. There's not many of them, and it's not hard to be connected with them. So everybody knows everybody. And of course, that has its downsides as well. It means that, as you say, you do have to, watch your step a little bit, because if you sully your reputation, the news travels very fast in a small community. And I think it has those advantages and concomitant disadvantages. Yes. So when it comes to these kinds of controversies, they take up all the airspace while they're going on, because everybody is thinking about the same thing at the same time.
Yeah, are you involved with the Heterodox Academy? I joined the Heterodox Academy because a colleague wanted me to join it, and then I turned off my emails. And they actually emailed me saying, are you still wanting to be a member? You're not getting our emails. And I said, yeah, I'm happy to support you, but don't send me junk mail.
Yeah.
So I'm not an active member, but I am on the membership list.
I joined it very early on. Before it started, I'd been watching from afar what was happening on American campuses, and I was interested in FIRE, the freedom and individual rights organization on campuses, and watching what they were doing in terms of monitoring violations of academic freedom and so on. And so when Heterodox Academy got started, I was quick to join. And there's a small but active community, Heterodox Academy community in New Zealand, and it's pretty valuable for us, especially with things like what has been going on recently in terms of that issue with the banning of people from Massey campus and the Mataranga Māori letter and so on.
Yeah, but I'm starting to wonder which is more important, the Heterodox Academy and its let's face it, uphill battle to try to establish the principle that universities should hire with an eye towards heterodoxy, or at least with multiple viewpoint diversity, or the more defensive Toby Young's Free Speech Union in the UK, which is not so much advocating for viewpoint diversity as just trying to protect people's jobs among those who already have them.
Yeah, well, I think they both have their place. I mean, the value for me, to be honest, of both of those organisations, and I'm a member of the New Zealand Free Speech Union, which is modelled on Toby Young's one, is community. To me, the best antidote to cancel culture is to have a strong community of people who will not forsake you if you get cancelled, because that allows one to be more courageous and not fear it so much. Because the worst thing for human beings is to be exiled or cut off or banished. And so if you have a community around you who are not going to do that and who are going to support you if things go wrong, then it certainly enables one to be braver. So that to me is the real value of both of those organisations, is just putting me in contact with like-minded people.
Protections are nice. I mean, as an individual, of course, I appreciate protections. And at the University of Sydney, people never believe me when I say this, but at the University of Sydney, we have exceptionally good protections for freedom of academic and even non-academic speech. It's written not only into university rules, but also into our enterprise bargaining agreement. So not only academics are covered by academic freedom, but everyone at the university is covered by intellectual freedom. And I think that's a fantastic thing. Few people outside the university are aware of that. But that only protects people who somehow snuck in, like me. I mean, I was hired because they thought I was going to be a medical sociologist churning out, highly cited quantitative papers, repeatedly establishing correlations that we already know about. I was certainly not hired to be a gadfly or to be a questioning, social scientist who, really does speak truth to power. And but I've never faced any pressure on that account. But I wasn't hired to do this, and we're never advertising for someone to do this. I mean, I've never seen an ad for a university social scientist that said, we're seeking an outsider voice who is going to upset received wisdom.
I'd like to think that was taken as read when people apply for academic positions. Of course, it isn't, but that to me would be the university fulfilling its proper role if that was just sort of expected of academics to be that kind of person. You know, whether they wanted to do it fully in public or more within their scholarly communities, that should be part of the role, is to question received wisdom. And
well, but who's
I
mean?
mean,
But people are human. I mean, you have a hiring committee with 5 people on it. One of them's a dean or a head of school. A couple of them are senior professors and a couple of junior professors, and each of them wants someone in their own area. Why? I'm not sure, because if you get someone else in your own area, that's splitting your teaching. So there's less. Both of you can't teach. I mean, if I'm the health sociologist and we hire a second health sociologist, all of a sudden, instead of teaching health sociology every year, I can only teach it every other year. So why people want people in their own field, I'm not sure. I mean, I
guess maybe they like research collaborators.
Well, they do, but you can get those at other universities. I mean, we at the University of Sydney have this series of niche groups who, even between a group, I won't name names, but between a group of three people, there's maybe one unit of study that applies to all 3 people's research areas. Yet, on a hiring committee, well, we'd like to establish a weight of expertise, a critical mass of expertise in this area, and that seems to be very persuasive on hiring committees. But I have never, and I'm going to state this categorically, I've never in 20 years heard any hiring pitch made on the basis that we really have to diversify our department and get someone who's not in an area that we already cover.
Well, it happened when they hired me, actually, at the Faculty of Education, because they had one other quantitative researcher, but he was doing very different things than I do. So they did partly hire me on the basis of wanting somebody who did quantitative work in educational assessment.
I was similarly brought in as the quants guy, and maybe we're the fraternity of quants guys who can speak our mind because we can teach statistics.
Yes, it took a few years before anybody realized that I had interests other than statistics. But
but that's not the same thing. I mean, I methodological specialization is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about viewpoint diversity. I mean, using numbers is not a viewpoint.
I take your point. Hey, I'm noticing a couple of comments in the chat there from Christopher. I don't know if Christopher's any relation of yours, Anthony, but
he's my brother.
He's your brother. Well, I mean, I'm very interested in these comments, especially the first there. He's saying, what is so often called the science today has little to do with scientific method as understood by Karl Popper. And I'm a big fan of Karl Popper, and I agree with that, Christopher. I think actually when I hear the definite pronoun, the definite article used before the word science, I have an allergic reaction. I think, if somebody says the science says X, it's actually a political statement almost all of the time, because the idea that, the science is settled, as some people say about certain things, is absolute nonsense from a Popperian point of view, because there's never settled science from that perspective, which is, of course, its great epistemic strength. I think that Popper's idea that the purpose of science is to falsify theories is one of the most genius insights in history. And one of the things because what we need is mechanisms to keep us honest and to divert us from our inbuilt biases. And it seems to me that the admonition that we need to disprove our theories is a very good way of doing that. So thank you for that comment.
And Popper, I know Popper has been politicized, but I think Popper thoroughly questioned the notion that there is such a thing as absolute truth that could be, that if something could be established as truth, it wouldn't be science. Well, Anthony, that's a very postmodern approach to truth, if you ask me.
I suppose you're right, actually, that we're saying we've certainly moved away from the objective, haven't we? If we're saying that we can never be sure that a theory is true, and that in fact we know it isn't, that it will always be flawed at some point.
Hey, anyone who says they want facts, I always say, whose facts do you want, yours or mine?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a reasonable point. And my comment about postmodernism before was very definitely the
I
Jerry
know.
Dunn kind of species of postmodernism. And, you know, to be clear on that, I think that the fundamental error made by Derrida was to see language as being ungrounded from, or some sort of unmoored from reality, which it clearly isn't. I mean, I'm a psycholinguist by training, and it's very clear to me that language is very much grounded in reality, because it's probably our principal means of describing reality. Now, I suppose ontologically we can start to split very fine hairs and say, well, you know, as human beings, what do we really know about reality? And that brings us back to Popper, actually. The answer is we're not sure about what reality is, and we're probing it as best we can. But I think that it seems that our perception of the world is at least correlated enough with reality to allow us to survive, and our scientific endeavors are correlated enough with reality to allow them to result in technology that works. So, you know, it's not true that that you know, in the continental sense, anything goes. That's where I very much draw the line. That any set of facts is not as good as any other set of facts. If we can test their correspondence with what works and observations of data and evidence, then that set of facts, as it were, or that theoretical framework is better than one that doesn't so correspond.
Getting back to practical academic freedom, I have a challenge for you. And Anthony, I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I think there's a tension between the idea that as a professor, I should teach in class the consensus viewpoint as I see it of my discipline on a topic. There's the alternative that no, I should teach what I think, you know, my own thoughts on the topic, even if they depart from the consensus view. Now, it's easy to say, oh, of course I should teach what I believe, but then, well, that implies that everyone else is going to teach what they believe. You know, I'm not sure that I want that. Where do you come down on that? I mean, should we be teaching in class our best effort to synthesize the consensus of the discipline, or should we be teaching what we find in our own research and scholarship?
Might depend a little bit on the level of the class that I'm teaching. As a scientist, I certainly would see it as important for my students to understand, you know, the state of the art in the discipline. I think that's kind of responsible teaching. If I was teaching in my former discipline in experimental psychology, I'd want them to know what the current theories were, and I'd also want them to know which theories were competing, so that they didn't get the idea that there was one theory that was correct, or that we had confidence would never change, or something like that. So I want them to get a sense of the different ideas that are competing at the forefront of thinking. And then I would also feel free to speculate from my own thinking, because actually here's a thought about that. My father was a mathematician, and towards the very end of his career, he said to me, you know, I think in mathematics, nobody learns anything much in lectures. They have to do all the work outside the lectures to learn. So I'll come to the conclusion that the point of a lecture in mathematics is to watch a mathematician doing mathematics, and to see it in action. And he loved chalk and blackboards. He loved the physicality of striking a blackboard with a piece of chalk, and going into a lecture, you know, perhaps without a clear idea of a conclusion, and working through it, you know, much as we might be in this conversation. It seems to me that, you know, live knowledge, as it were, is a really good thing for students to experience, so they don't get the idea that everything's been solved once and for all.
Salvatore's book talks about that. It talks about the discontent with people not being able to attend lectures, and the involvement of their tutors and lecturers because of the pandemic. There's a big decline in. So I might as well praise Salvatore's book.
Funny you should mention Australia's universities. Can they reform? I considered including New Zealand universities in it, but I emailed the editor of what's the big newspaper in New Zealand? There's an Auckland.
New Zealand Herald, is it?
New Zealand Herald. I emailed the education editor. I said, if I include New Zealand in this book, would you cover it? And he said, a book by an Australia-based scholar that only mentions New Zealand in passing? Of course not. And I'm like, well, I can't put New Zealand at the center of the book. You've got 8 universities to 39. I've got to cover them each, And
as you said, New Zealand can be a bit clubby. So
yeah.
Do you have problems with codes of conduct, which was the sort of a catch-22 in the Peter Ridd case? The court basically held that the university was wrong to dismiss him, but because he sort of tackled it and made his objections public, he had breached the code of conduct, and therefore they could dismiss him anyway, which is a real catch-22 situation, I think. Did you have codes of conduct which could restrict freedom of speech?
Universities do have codes of conduct here, of course, and they could have that effect. I'm not really aware of them having so far any incidents that have directly involved a code of conduct being brought to bear against what somebody has said. And interestingly, and probably the biggest explosion of outrage in New Zealand has been this issue with the Mataranga Māori letter. And of the 7 professors, one of them stood down as acting dean, not because he was making an apology, but because he didn't want it to disrupt, the running of his faculty. But none of them were threatened with dismissal, or in fact, the Royal Society of New Zealand is investigating 2 of them who are fellows of the Royal Society, and may end up kicking them out, although I doubt it now that people like Dawkins and Steven Pinker have got involved. I think they're sufficiently embarrassed that they'll squirm out of it. But to come back to the question about codes of conduct, what I worry about more is their preemptive effect, that people just keep their mouths shut if they have got anything controversial they might want to say. And there's no doubt, I think, that that's happening.
Well, this is part of the business about whether you teach what you believe to be true as distinct from what's in the curriculum that you should teach. And obviously, the general view should be conveyed. But, it's said that science advances with the death of scientists until the leading scientist dies. The alternative viewpoint, which may be correct, or more correct, is no.
That sounds more of a Kuhnian position than a Popperian one.
Yeah. Actually, I'm disappointed that we're always talking about science advancing when, most of us aren't science. I guess, Michael, if you're a psychologist, you can claim you're a quasi-scientist.
I would claim that I'm very much a scientist. Where I learned at Monash University in the 1980s, they took an extremely scientific approach. In fact, they were all dyed-in-the-wool Popperians, and it had been set up that way. Professor Ross Day, who was the founding professor of the Monash Psychology Department, hand-picked people to make sure that there would be no social psychology here. This is all visual perception and physiology and these things.
You are aware that the rest of us make fun of psychologists' science envy just as much as we make fun of economists' mathematics envy. Yeah, I'm not so interested in science moving forward as in society moving forward. Scientists are welcome to come along with us. But I have to say, something that troubled me, Michael, in what you said a minute ago about these big-time international scholars getting involved, is that it seems like, I find it very disappointing that disproportionately the voices for viewpoint diversity, for heterodox speech, for being able to speak your mind or have independent thought without having to worry about losing your job or being deplatformed, that overwhelmingly the people who come to the defense of that are, let's face it, rich and successful men like Anthony. And I'd like to see some, I'd like to call on, capital D diversity. I'd like to call on, on women, on members of sexual minorities, on, younger people. They should be stepping up. It shouldn't be a bunch of, old white men who insist that freedom matters.
We can reflect on why that is. I wouldn't necessarily agree that they're by any means all men. I mean, there are people like Kathleen Stock from the English academic who recently resigned over her gender critical reviews, and the old Trojan Camille Paglia, who I've got endless respect for because she says exactly what she thinks at all times.
And Bettina Arndt here in Australia.
So I think that there are certainly women involved, but in the end, the reason that these people who do speak out are well established and wealthy and so on is because they're not scared of being cancelled. I mean, who's going to cancel Pinker?
No, because there are lots of young people on Twitter who are at no risk of being cancelled, who instead of joining the mob, baying for my blood and yours, could very well, be the mob saying, "How dare you tear down these freedoms that I want to enjoy when I get older."
I agree. That would be wonderful. But how do we make that happen?
I don't know. I'd love to see it.
So would I. I mean, I'm hanging out for it. I'm hoping that my 8-year-old daughter will grow up into a generation that rebels against all this woke crap and decides that it's time to push back for liberalism.
I'm not even against woke stuff. I embrace most woke stuff. What I criticize is the extremely authoritarian way in which it is being imposed.
That to me is what I mean by woke stuff. I mean, I don't care what people think. They can think, that there are 500 genders, and I don't mind. They're welcome to say all of that. But yes, like you, I object to the authoritarianism of it, and that to me is at the core of that movement, if we can call it a movement, whatever it is, that culture is authoritarian, and there's no getting away from it. It's extremely authoritarian. It reminds me of nothing more, I must say, than the English Puritans during their interregnum under Cromwell.
Absolutely. I'm glad there's someone else out there who connects wokeism today with Puritanism, and in particular Calvinism, as wokeism today being the contemporary era of Calvinism and iconoclasm of the 17th century. I see the connection very clearly. I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah, well, no, it's moralistic in that way. It's deeply guilt-ridden in that way. There's all sorts of things that it has in common. It's Calvinism without God, I would say. Yeah,
people want to burden Catholics with guilt, but Catholics confess their guilt and then it's it's gone. Calvinists take their guilt to the grave. It's really a the Calvinist spirit that drives us here. Look, Michael, I know you said you had to go in an hour. I'm happy to talk for 2 hours or 3 hours on these events, but happy to keep it to an hour also. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about what's going on in New Zealand?
Well, I think we've covered the ground in terms of academic freedom, and I think in the end, what happens in New Zealand is what happened in Australia about 2 or 3 years ago. That's always been the case, and what happened in America 8 years ago. When Jonathan Haidt visited New Zealand, 3 years ago now or so, I had the good fortune to meet him and have a conversation with him. One of the advantages of being in a small country, there were only 2 members of the Heterodox Academy here in Wellington. The other one being James Kersted, who you know.
I know James, of course.
And that was when I met James, was in the presence of Jonathan Haidt, because he called us both to have a meeting with him in his hotel.
I'd be a little worried about that.
But at the time, he made the observation that he thought, New Zealand was a healthy place for academic freedom in comparison with certainly America and the UK and even Australia. But I would say, things have changed now, and New Zealand has caught up to the rest of the Western world, and it's kind of sad. Decay.
Before we go, we should at least mention that you run your own podcast, Free Kiwis, on YouTube.
With the aforementioned James Kierstead, yes.
I am
and you have featured on one of our episodes, indeed.
I'm going to try to share screen. This may or may not work, but let's see how it goes. And I'm not sure this is. Show you Free Kiwis, and I think I have to. Yep, I have to show. Sorry, guys.
Well, what if I put?
We're trying hard here, struggling. No, this is going to work. It's going to work easy. It's not going to be pretty, but it's going to happen. Let's see how it goes. Yes, I finally got the option to share screen, and come on screen. Well, maybe it's going to freeze my whole podcast to do it. All right, let's start this. Let's stop sharing. I hope people can hear me. It seems like things have frozen. That's a good signal to wrap up. Check out Free Kiwis, and if anyone can hear me, thanks for joining us today. I don't know if you can hear me.
Can I put in a what if I just put a link there to Free Kiwis? Is that
I will put a link in the description, but my whole screen has frozen, so I'm a bit concerned about
I can see your lips
our
moving
stream
sporadically there, and I can certainly hear you. Yeah.
You can see them. I can't.
Yeah.
Well, you're frozen up now, but I think I can still hear you. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm getting error after error after error, so I think it's time to go. Thank you very much, Michael Johnston, for joining us today. Thanks, Anthony, for jumping in. Much appreciated.
Nice to meet you, Anthony.
Good to meet you too, yes.
And if technology permits, I'll try to run another Professor's Podcast next Friday. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.